Welcome to the Brothers Random Show. My name is Travis.
I'm Michael.
And we are two ordinary brothers discussing extraordinary things and some random shit. So the topics on this show range from theology, masculinity, movies, philosophy, books, pop culture, and many other subjects. We often talk about the people we admire and the wisdom that they share. People such as Jordan B. Peterson, Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, who we believe is the sage of our time. Michael, we got our first guest.
Our first guest, Nathan Dilts. Welcome, sir.
Hey, thank you, guys. I'm glad to be here.
Nathan has been a friend of mine for a very, very long time. We met through your mutual friend, my brother, Cody Brown, and we've both been on the Cody Brown's show and been on there here and there, and we actually were in the same religious sect for several years. I mean, for most of my growing up. And we just wanted to introduce you.
Yeah, I met Cody because my wife and his first wife, Mary, are sisters. That's how I met Cody, and that was like 25 years ago. So how old are you now, Michael?
I'm 35.
So that means
I was 10 years old. Yeah.
10 years old. Yeah. And you was a wee little babe.
Yep.
Just barely popped out.
Yep. Yeah, you were a baby, Michael. I was the toddler running around. So
yeah, Nathan, go ahead and introduce yourself. We figured you'd kind of walk us through your upbringing in the LDS church and getting into.
Before we do that, Michael, I want to just say that Nathan, I every time I see you, you are the most interesting conversationalist in the room. And I always have one of the best conversations I have with you. And because this platform, because what we're doing here is conversational, we wanted to have you on, and this will most likely be a several part series on our show, so audience members can look forward to that. But the reason that we wanted to have you on is because you're good at this. And so Michael, so just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your polygamous awakening, if you want to call it that.
Awakening. Wow. Well, no pressure. So now we're going to make or break the reputation here in the next couple of episodes, or we'll find out. It's a funny thing. I don't think I think everyone should consider how remarkable their lives really are. And oftentimes we don't feel like it because we're living those lives. And certainly there are aspects of life that are monotonous, or it's the day-to-day hustle to just provide and things. But I think what makes any good conversation is when you're genuinely interested in other people, and when you realize how interesting they are because of their diverse backgrounds or experiences and things. And mine, there are times when I reflect on it. It's very interesting. I felt like I had a very normal childhood. I didn't realize in some ways how, I don't want to say it wasn't strange, but it's definitely, it's something I don't take for granted anymore. I was born and raised Mormon, true blue through and through. My mom and her family's pedigree goes clear back to the very beginnings of Mormonism. My ancestors were among the first families to join the church. The Webb Black Shop in Nauvoo, that's my ancestors. They built the wagon wheels and the tools that the Saints used to cross the plains to come to Utah after they were driven out of Missouri and then subsequently Nauvoo, Illinois. And so I'm so LDS. I was actually born in LDS Hospital in Salt Lake City. We lived 8 minutes from the Salt Lake Temple. My dad was a convert to the church. He was exposed to Mormonism in his mid-adolescence, joined the church when he was about 17 or 18, went on a mission to Germany, went to BYU, met my mom. They got married, and my dad, when he got back from his mission and graduated from BYU, he needed a job, and he walked into the genealogical library, and he was at the general reference desk, and there was this patron who was looking for help on a genealogical document, and it was in German, which was where my dad went on his mission, and so he translated it, and after he helped this patron out, the fellow at the desk like, well, what can I do for you? And he says, well, I'm looking for a job. And he says, well, you got one. So my dad literally went, convert, mission, BYU, and went straight to work for the church as a church historian and a genealogist. And he did that for his entire career. He only retired a couple of years ago. And anyway, as a result of that, I grew up learning an enormous amount of church history. We would take vacations in the summer, and we'd drive everywhere for our vacations, and we'd camp. And while we were driving, my job was to sit next to my dad and keep him awake by talking to him. And we would talk about religion and politics. And obviously, when it came to religion, I got a lot of church history. So I was one of these strange kids that had an inordinate amount of exposure and knowledge about church history and things. In fact, there were plenty of times my dad would teach me about things in church history and be like, "Now, don't bring this up in Sunday school or or priest. Don't talk about that. Like, this is for you and me. This is me teaching you." And okay,
So even back then, there were things that the church didn't want you talking about.
Right. So I'm just going to lay it out, I guess. My dad taught me about the Adam God theory. Back then it was the Adam God theory, which was openly discussed and debated and talked about at BYU up until that talk by, I believe it was Spencer W. Kimball, who kind of put a kibosh on that, if I remember right. I might be getting the general authority wrong, but yeah, somebody...
For the layman, Nathan, would you want to just in layman terms, real quick, sum up the Adam God theory?
Well, it's funny because if you talk to fundamentalists, they call it the Adam God doctrine. If you talk to a small handful of very educated church Mormons, they'll refer to it as the Adam God theory. And it's essentially, in a nutshell, it's the idea that Adam, the first... as in the Adam and Eve Adam, was God, and there's actually quite a bit of debate even among fundamentalists who believe this as a doctrine as to how that specifically is expressed. But in the church, I don't think anybody but church historians at this point have, or there might be a few church history buffs or enthusiasts who might have some exposure to it. But yeah, it's essentially the idea that Adam is God. And so there's that. He told me about it. He's like, this is something that the church used to discuss. Brigham Young talked about, that used to be debated, but then the prophet came out in I think it was 1985 and said, no more debate on this, we're done debating this. Yeah. And kind of brush that aside. Another thing that my dad taught me about years and years ago was the idea that Jesus might have been married. And it's really funny because, that was another thing that used to be taught in the early days of the church. And then it was very quickly kind of dropped and pushed away. And then with the whole Da Vinci Code thing that came out, I can't remember when that movie came out, but came this resurgence of the discussions and little, closeted discussions and debates in church and everything. And of course, Mormon fundamentalists, by and large, roll their eyes and they're like, well, yeah, great. You guys are now interested in the idea, and Mormon fundamentalism buys deeply into the idea of Jesus as Mary, because as being married from the standpoint of it supporting their views on plural marriage. And then and so those were the kinds of things I was actually taught about as I was growing up. And it was, I didn't realize at the time what a blessing it was. I was just kind of like, sure, Dad, let's talk about this. And, oh, that's interesting. But, okay, I won't melt down my Sunday school teacher or my youth class leader by, hey, did Jesus have plural wives? Like, okay, all right. It's just, and he was teaching it to me from a standpoint of not like he was secretly teaching me doctrines contrary to church. He was just like, this is, what happened in church history. And he knew about this stuff as a church historian and a genealogist. And so he was just teaching me about that. And then I think another interesting aspect of being raised in this combination of my mom and my mother and father was my dad was a convert, but a real convert. And it was interesting, though, when you work for the church, you get to see the more human side and where some of the failings of men come into play more than, for most church members, the general authorities are these guys who appear from behind the curtain twice a year. They give these real spiritual, uplifting talks, and they all wear gray suits and red or blue conservative ties, and and give you these cute, humorous anecdotes and these spiritually uplifting stories, and then they disappear behind the curtain. And
there's no connection there where they would get to know this person on an individual, personal level.
No, and it's interesting because wow. We're going to go down some strange roads. I was actually part of the immigration stake, which has Federal Heights Ward as part of it. I was part of the 27th Ward. Federal Heights and immigration stake was the stake in the ward where most of the apostles and their families and children lived. So I grew up with half the apostles' kids, went to school with half the apostles' kids. I was
the church authorities is what you're saying, like the church authorities.
Yeah, and not just the church authorities. I'm talking about the quorum of the 12 apostles. Like President Gordon B. Hinckley, his son was my stake president. His grandson, I went to school with him, and we were like acquaintances. I'm not going to say we're deep friends. I mean, especially now, he's probably like, I didn't know that guy. But hopefully he would remember my name at least. But yeah, we were acquaintances, and I was like, I would go to stake functions and things, and they would be there. And it was interesting because so there was that whole angle of the experience. But my dad, he was interacting with leaders and general authorities as a church employee who worked in that big tall office building in downtown Salt Lake and in the family history library and things like that. And when you get to see somebody, working a 40-hour week, you see when they go to the bathroom, you see when they stub their toe, and so it was this interesting thing. And then there was the frustrations he had at work. And it was funny because my dad would come home and he'd be frustrated about some dumb things that were happening at work. Like we all experience, like why is my boss doing this stupid thing? Or why is this stupid thing happening at work? And the funny thing is these stupid things and these stupid bosses were like leaders of the church. And so, very early on, it was an amazing experience because my dad would have to sit me down and I'd be like, Dad, this sounds like it sucks. And he's like, well, it's frustrating, but you have to realize that the gospel is true, but, people make mistakes. And so I grew up in this environment being taught deeply on church history, seeing the warts and the stub toes and the farts and the different things, and then being taught, you have to separate the gospel from people. And so, in a nutshell, that was my upbringing. And then, so I was born and raised Salt Lake City, Utah. Like I say, born in LDS hospital, 8 minutes from the temple, in the same ward and stakes as half the apostles and their kids. And
so what brings you? what brings you around to polygamy,
Oh,
essentially?
dude, now that's a crazy story. That one's a bolt out of the blue because like I had like even with my dad taught me about polygamy and the history of the church, plural marriage as it's called. He taught me about it as a historical thing, and then he did what most Mormons, if they're informed enough to do, they well, we did that, and and then um, and then it was done away with the first declaration of the church, Declaration 1 in the Pearl of Great Price, and so I didn't think about it at all. It just wasn't. I mean, I think I was more informed just because I knew about it from a historical context. But I had a vague notion that there were a few people out there, but they were cross-eyed, inbred sheep herders somewhere in Utah, and there was like 30 of them, and like that was my notion of. I had no see being born and raised in the heart of the church, like. I learned about the RLDS church because it was still called that back then. Now it's Community Church of Christ or Community Church of Christ.
And for the layman's, that's the church. For the layman's, that's the church that when Joseph Smith died, Emma and Brigham Young kind of separated ways. Emma went and did the RELDS church, and Brigham Young came out west with the saints and started the LDS church.
Yeah, and they're probably the largest split off from Brighamite Mormonism, to date. Now, and see, I did learn about. I actually went and visited the RLDS temple probably when I was about 15 or 16. That's when I got exposed. Like, oh, and then I learned that there were actually 12 or 13 split offs at the time of Joseph Smith's death. But most of them were very minor and disappeared relatively quickly. It was primarily the RLDS church, or what became the RLDS church, and then what Brigham Young led out west to Utah. But for most of my life, up until I had that experience where I went out and went to the RLDS church, like I said, I think I was 15 or 16 year old when I first encountered that. I didn't realize that there was any other form of Mormonism, and I think realistically, 80%, if not more, of the Mormons in the church today probably don't have any clue that there's, hundreds of thousands of fundamentalist Mormons out there of different stripes, and they are, because you're just taught this is the true church, this is the true and living church, and these are the brethren, and it just doesn't even occur to you that there's anyone else. And that was me before my mission. Other than that brief exposure to RLDS, I didn't think about fundamentalists. Didn't know they were really there. Like I said, there was this fuzzy notion, but they were those 30 cross-eyed inbred sheep herders in southern Utah somewhere that were dying off from inbreeding or whatever. And so I go on my mission. I served a 2-year mission in American Sign Language. I went to LA and New York. It was a tremendous experience. And I come back, and I'm going to Salt Lake Community College to get my generals in, because that's really cheap. If you go, geez Louise, you go to any university, it's like unbelievably expensive. So I was going to go for the cheap credits, get my generals done. That way I'd only have to spend 2 years on the expensive university. And I would do like youth counseling, like get my bachelor's in youth counseling. And I was going to be a seminary or institute teacher. That was my battle plan. And I'm at Institute at Salt Lake Community College, Redwood campus. And I am in this American Sign Language Institute class because I want to keep up my language skills, right? So I'm in this class, and we're all talking about going to the temple. And there's this redhead at the back of the class who's like, we're all like, hey, let's all go together to class, go to the temple, do, vicarious ordinances and things. And we're like, let's do it. we're all doing it, and then she's like, "Yeah, hey, sorry, I'm gonna back out." And we're like, "Well, why?" Like good nosy Mormons, like it doesn't occur to you, like mind your own business, like, well, come on, And she's like, "Yeah, no," and she's like, "Well, I don't have a temple recommend," and we're like, "Oh, that's easy. You just go talk to your bishop. He'll do a short interview and give you a recommend." And she's all like, "Yeah, well, I'm pretty sure that the bishop might not give me a recommend." And we're like, "Oh, like, do we need to talk repentance? Like, what's?" And she's all like, "No." And it's like, and she's like, and she signs to me. She says, she goes like this, which is a wedding ring 2 or 3 times. But with the F, the letter F as a wedding ring 2 or 3 times. And I'm like, I'd never seen this sign before. And I'm like, what is this sign? And she spells it out for me, finger spells it. And she finger spells fundamentalist. And my whole experience on my mission in LA and New York, I'm like, fundamentalist, I'm thinking fundamentalist Christian. And I'm like, what? I'm like so confused. Like, what is a fundamentalist Christian doing in a Mormon institute? This would be like hell. Like they would be like, this would be the last place you would catch a fundamentalist Christian, would be in a Mormon institute class. So I'm like, I'm so confused. So I'm like, the class gets over and we're all doing this in sign language. And I'm all sitting there walking out with her. I'm like, "So you're a fundamentalist," and I'm not connecting. I'm thinking this is the weirdest sign for Christian fundamentalists ever. I'm like, I'm not connecting the dots. Like it's, and I'm like, so you're not a member? And she's like, "No, I'm not a member." "Well, why are you coming to an institute?" "Oh, I believe this stuff and I want to learn about it." I'm like, "Well, you believe it, great. So that that Jesus Christ is our Savior." And she's, "Oh yeah." And I'm like, "Yeah, great." And then that Joseph Smith is the prophet of God. And she's like, "Yeah, I know." I'm like, "You do?" She's like, "Oh yeah." I'm like, "Well then, the Book of Mormon's a true book of scripture, right? Along with the Bible, right?" And she's like, "Oh yeah, I know." I'm like, "You do?" I'm thinking, great, this is the world. I'm like, and I literally, like, right on the spot, I'm like, "Will you be baptized?" Because like I just gotten on my mission. So it's like, she's got Jesus Christ figured out, she's got Joe Smith figured out, the Book of Mormon figured out, the church is true. "Will you be baptized?" And she's all like, "Well, no." And I'm like, "Why not?" And I'm like, oh, it's your parents. Your parents won't allow you? It's like, well, I don't know that they'd be happy, but I think they would be supportive if I chose to. And I'm like, what is going on here? And by that time, we had to split to go different classes. So I'm like, well, we'll talk later and see you. And so I go home that night, and my dad comes into the living room, and I'm like, "Dad, I had this really weird experience today." He's like, "Well, what's that?" I said, I met this fundamentalist." He's like, "Really?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And he's all like, "Christian or Mormon?" And I'm like, "Mormon." Like what is that, Dad? And he says, "Well, son, Mormon fundamentalists are these people that they wear long prairie dresses, they have these funny hairdos, and they live polygamy. But beyond that, I really don't know. So you're gonna go have to find one and ask him if you really want to learn about it." And this was 100% my. So you need to understand, just real quick, is kind of rewinding just a little bit. But my whole growing up life, I visited dozens of other churches and faiths and religion. Whenever we go on vacation, my dad would just find, if he couldn't find a close LDS ward to go to on Sunday, he'd just pick a church and we go. So I went to Buddhist temples. I went to holy rollers, evangelists, Christian. Before my mission, I had spoken more in other people's churches than I had in LDS churches. Like it's an interest. And my dad always taught that, if what you believe is true, then you shouldn't be threatened by whatever anyone else has to share. It's either true and you accept it, or it's not, and you learn from it and let it roll off your back. And he also taught like that if you really want to learn about somebody else's faith, you need to go find somebody who was striving and practicing that faith and ask them. And so when he did that, he gave me this like little synopsis, which funny enough, my wife, oh, I just gave away the plot. That girl that I met later becomes my wife, but that's kind of another story. We'll get to it maybe, but anyway, she wasn't wearing a long dress. She was dressed normal. I didn't realize at the time, but she had long pants on, long shirt, but it was very, it was fashion forward enough that it wasn't obvious that she was dressing weird. And she didn't have weird hair. So my dad was obviously thinking like FLDS or Short Creek, but she wasn't either of those. Anyway, so she's like, go and find somebody who believes it and ask him if you really want to know what they believe. So I'm like, oh, great. So the next day I come back and I'm like, I'm ready. I know what's going on now. So, and then I finally get the sign too, like an F for fundamentalist wedding ring tour thing. I'm like, oh, duh. Yeah. Okay. Now I got it. So I'm heading, I head back to school the next day, and I start grilling her. I just start questioning her. And man, I was pulling out all these like great scriptures, rebuking her, inviting her to, repent and come into the true fold and cast off her iniquitous ways. And she just kept replying like, oh, yeah, what you're saying makes some sense, but I just got to tell you, this thing I believe it's true. And I'm like, what? Wait a minute. No, sister, let me explain to you how this goes. I shall bear down in pure testimony to you, and you shall cower in spiritual, humility before the boldness of my testimony, and succumb to, the truth of the true and living church, and repent. But she just kept bearing a testimony of me, and it was really annoying because I'd come up with these great scriptural things. She couldn't answer them, but then she'd bear a testimony. I'm like, oh, wait, no. And anyway, what I didn't know is she would run home and ask her parents and like all these people that she knew, like, okay, he just asked me about this, and this. How do I respond? And she'd collect all the answers and come back the next day and be like, well, finally, she comes to Institute with this little pamphlet, and unbeknownst to me, because I'm pretty dense and I don't catch on to the wily ways of sisters, she conveniently is sitting there reading from this pamphlet that has strategic things highlighted, and she's all like, and I'm coming along and I'm like, oh, what's that? And she's like, oh, this little thing? Oh, this is just a little pamphlet. Would you like to see it? And so I'm like, yes. And I'm like, aha, I can take this and I'll pull this apart and we'll bring this to a head, and repentance and the waters of baptism will receive another soul into the celestial kingdom. And so, so I come home with this pamphlet. I read it over once.
What's this pamphlet? What's this pamphlet called?
It was called Celestial Plural Marriage References.
Really?
And
who put it together? Was it Musser?
I don't think it was Musser. I think it was literally a compilation of quotes from the Journal of Discourses, from the scriptures, and from the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith. And
sounds like a Kraut book. Sounds like a Kraut book.
It has that flavor, but I think it was compiled by Donna Baer.
No, really? Okay.
I think so. And so anyway, it was just
I have no idea who any of those people are. So
yeah. She used to be a Sunday school in the group. She used to be a Sunday school teacher in the group. In fact, I just went to her funeral 3 or 4 months ago. She was an amazing lady, really cool lady. But I think it was literally nothing but a pure compilation of, quotes from Journal of Discourses, scriptures, and teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith in support of plural marriage. And so that's why it was called plural marriage references. It's just literally that's all it was. And I read it through once. I read it through twice. And when I set it down, I knew I was sitting at a crossroads. And I as clear as day, I knew I had one of two choices. I would either have to put it away, never look at it or anything like it again, and go on my merry way with my plans to go get a bachelor's in youth counseling, become an Institute seminary teacher, find my big sweater Mormon girl at BYU, get married in the Salt Lake Temple, send my, have my 4 to 6 children, raise them all, send them on missions, and grow old and die, safely tucked in the womb of Mother Church, and that was the path that way. And then the other path was a big, I had no idea what was down the other path, except that I would have to see if this was possibly true, and if it was true, and if these things were of God, that I'd follow it. And here I am. so yeah,
to fast forward to where you are now. So are you currently a practicing polygamist then?
No, I'm not. I at one point, for a brief time, I had two wives, for only about 2.5 years. And then there was a year-long courtship before that. But yeah, a little ways in, she decided that it wasn't for her, and decided to take off. And so ever since then, I was married to my wife for 7 years before that happened. And then afterwards, I had a couple more opportunities, but I wasn't in the right place spiritually, mentally, emotionally, physically. It was pretty heartbreaking for me when that didn't work out. And
did it shake your faith in the belief in fundamentalism?
No, it well, and yeah, no. The funny thing was that didn't shake my faith. That was my failing, human failing. That didn't shake my faith. And it's a funny thing. In my mind, in my heart, and I'd like to think that everyone likes to think they're reasonably objective. We all participate in self-delusion to one degree or another. It's just a matter of how you can critically stop every once in a while and really examine things. But for my part, I feel like I've been a pretty consistent believer in terms of my faith and everything. My experience has been like my belief in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Like it had its roots in my childhood, but honestly, it really locked in during my mission. I had a tremendous missionary experience, had tremendous experience in the MTC. I would say my experience of being born again, Alma style, happened while I was in the not Alma style as in like Alma the Younger, but I'm talking about where he talks about a mighty change of heart. That mighty change of heart, that being born again experience, that happened for me in the MTC, and then obviously it was confirmed throughout my mission and throughout the rest of my life, and I obviously had a strong foundation in my youth. And the funny thing is I feel like I've always been true to my testimony and conviction about my faith and my beliefs. What's been strange to me in my life is how things have moved around me. So when I joined the group, or what's called now, well, it's still called the group now, but was called by some AUB. When I joined it 24, 25 years ago, it was a very different thing than what it became later. And in fact, in some ways, I was a priesthood quorum advisor or leader in AUB. I was a Sunday school teacher in AUB. I like teaching youth. Youth have always been my favorite demographic to teach young adults. I love teaching young adults. I loathe teaching adults because A, they're extraordinarily boring, and B, they know it all already. And so they're rough. Like when I teach adults, the ones who are asleep are asleep. The ones who are awake are just watching you to make sure you get it right. And they're going to sit straight when you go off the path. And it's like with youth, I feel like I love it when they engage and they're confrontational and they ask hard questions. But I feel like that we're learning together and we're exploring together, and they're a lot more open to like, hey, let's dive into the scriptures together and go explore this together and figure it out. Ask me your tough question. Let's go figure it out together. And so I was big in teaching the youth, and anyway, I ended up starting to teach a bunch of adult classes at their request, which and basically I started out when Owen, so Rulon was sort of so Short Creek split because of Rulon All Red, and Short Creek and Hilldale split, and then Rulon and his group and what other fundamentalists call All Redders, they stayed.
So for the layman's, that's where Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey, those people in the FLDS church, that was a split. We split at a point with Rulon All Red, and that went into the Jeff's group, and
Yep.
we kind of split. There was a split that went on there. We went our way, they went their way.
Ideologically and spiritually, that split was really between the group that the first principle for them was obedience, and that's that be sweet and pray and obey. That obedience is first, and then what became the Rulon or the All Red group was agency first. So, and so,
have you watched that series, Nathan? Have you watched the Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey series?
I haven't. I haven't had it. My exposure was talking. When I first came into the group 24, 25 years ago, there were the grandma generation, the grandma and grandpa generation. These were folks that were children of the raids, like that happened in the 50s when they came and raided the Hilldale, when the Arizona governor literally did a massive police raid and came in and arrested a bunch of people at Short Creek and Hilldale, which is the same city. It's just on the Arizona-Utah border. But the children were now the grandpas and grandpas, and they had stories of their parents, being arrested or running and hiding from, cops and federal law enforcement officers and things like that. And then they were also people who still had family members who were now part of this Be Sweet, Pray and Obey, Jeff's FLDS group. They literally have family members and like whole huge parts of their family that when that split happened, and I was talking and I was picking the brains of these like grandmas and grandpas and listening to their stories and having me teach me about the history of this group I'd come to join. And anyways, so when I first joined, it was under Owen. I never met Rulon. Rulon had been killed before I joined. Owen was the leader of the All Redder group at that point, or the AUB, or the group, whatever you want to call it. He was the leader of the group at the time. And
you were saying that they valued agency more than obedience.
Yeah. And in fact, with my own ears, there was, see, when I encountered Mormon fundamentalism, because I had been raised so strongly in the church, a lot of the doctrines weren't particularly shocking to me because of my background, where my dad had been teaching me about what had happened in church history. It was basically just like I was dropped in a time machine and shot back to 18, whatever the date on the DeLorean was, except in 85 at November 2nd, 1885 at 4 p.m. or whatever, right? Like it was literally like just being hopped in a time machine, and I was just seeing what the church was and believed, 150 years earlier, kind of a thing. And it didn't, none of it was surprising to me. I was like, oh, okay, well, yeah, I mean, that's what the church used to believe, so you still hung on to that, okay. And so I wasn't bothered by any of the doctrines per se, because I had the historical context for a lot of it. The only question I had was about authority. And as a church, Mormon, authority is something they really pound really hard. And it's like, these guys this is the living church, and this is the only place with the authority, and these are the prophets, apostles. And so it's like, my only question is, well, okay, do you guys have the authority to seal men and women in the new and everlasting covenant, including full marriage?
And for the layman on that maybe doesn't even know anything about the LDS church or anything, but for the layman, authority would be basically the right to act in God's name. This is how the LDS church teaches it, is the right to act in God's name in this way. So if I have the authority, I can do certain things that you may not, right?
This is where the church gets its idea that it is the only true church. That's where that comes from, and that's why. So Catholics and Lutherans, they believe that their church is the only church too, but they don't preach it all the time. They don't say constantly, this is the only true church. So,
well, they don't have to, because they came straight from the apostles of Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago. By their tradition. Yeah. And since Mormonism follows a restorationist model, the teachings of the church advocate there was a great apostasy about 100 to 200 years after the death of Christ, and thus requiring a new dispensation or a restoration of priesthood authority to the earth. And that was accomplished through the prophet Joseph Smith, by Peter, James, and John, and by John the Baptist, we could have other fun conversations. But anyway.
you can get really deep into that, but
and we won't dig all that up. But so for me as a church Mormon, I'm like asking myself, are you just a bunch of crazy? Well, man, and boy, just as a cultural thing, real quick, I gotta tell you, I was blown away. Obviously from my Prejudice point of view, where there was only 30 of you, and you were all cross-eyed inbred sheep herders in southern Utah that were breeding yourselves out of existence. Like, to find out that there's literally thousands, like, my this gal that introduced me to these concepts and these principles, I started like hanging out, and we'd go places together, and she'd be like, oh, there's a fundamentalist. We'd be in a store, and she'd like point out 3 of them. I'm like Lord Frollo in Hunchback of Notre Dame, like lifting up the rock, like they're everywhere. It's like, who knew the shitty? I was waiting for the court of miracles to appear where all of you guys dwelt. Like, I had you don't, because everyone thinks of I worked at Payless Shoe Source, and some short creakers walked in, and the gal I was working with, she's like, those are polygamists. And I'm like, oh, okay. And she's like, you can tell by the dress and the hair. And I'm like, oh, okay. And they don't use cell phones. And I'm like, what? And then she leaves to go in the back room, and the lady pulls out a cell phone and like calls her husband to ask about buying shoes. But anyway, it was so wild to like I promise, if most church members in Salt Lake are like me, where you just are oblivious, you have they're everywhere, and you just see them, and you're just like, wow, And so that was an interesting thing about.
Well, and they're really secretive as well, because I mean, I don't know what the laws are like now, but they can really be prosecuted, and they're secretive for probably a plethora of reasons. But one of the reasons is that they, like you were saying, in the 1950s, there were a bunch of raids that happened that put a bunch of people in prisons. But one of the reasons that we come to know through the Warren Jeffs group, which is obviously a separate group, one of the reasons they're secretive is because they were also farming out children to church authorities.
Yeah, and a host of other gross wickednesses, to be sure. Yeah, until the the reality show Sister Wives came out, like it was, there was a kind of it was enculturated because of that raid experience, and just because of prejudice too. When you're not part of the true church and you show up and you're, it was, it was very off-putting. I remember when we joined the group, and we were living out in Eagle Mountain, and we actually had visiting teachers and home teachers. And finally, at one point, my wife's like, you know what, we should sort of clue them in, just,
Yeah.
And I was like, well, you know what, follow the Spirit, honey. If you feel like telling them, that's fine. And it was funny because when she did, no joke, all of a sudden, like, all of the neighbor kids weren't allowed to play with our kids anymore. And it was just, and I'm not saying that near every area, and that's not all church Mormons, but it was mind blowing to me, having grown up as a dyed in the wool church Mormon, to see what prejudice looked like from the other side. Like, we were letting our kids play with them. We hadn't adopted this sort of, FLDS view of you're all evil Gentiles and outsiders, and we won't associate with you if you aren't a part of the truly worthy people. We were completely like open and loving, and our kids played with our neighbors' kids, and like there were a few families that were still cool with us afterwards. But it was strange. As soon as the visiting teachers and home teachers found out, that we had fundamentalist leanings, it was like all of a sudden, like, our kids went over to play with the neighbor kid next day, and they're like, "Oh, my mom says I can't play with you anymore."
And this is a painful reminder of where they came from. This is what we like. This is what we like to talk about, because occasionally Michael and I have talked about this, but the same thing happened to us. My parents were prominent members of our small town, and then when they were caught practicing, I guess is the best way, or leanings, the same thing happened. We were basically cut off from the entire community for about 10 years.
Now, I mean, I'm going to point out that this prejudice can go both ways, because my wife will tell the story that that her mom would tell her that she couldn't play with her friends that weren't fundamentalists. So
it goes both ways.
The prejudice can kind of go either way.
And it's not good. In fact, years ago, I don't know if you guys, I might be dating myself here, but I don't know if you remember what blogs were back in the day. When the little birds used to tap it out on a stone tablet, on the Flintstone computer. I did a blog, and I talked about, I wrote a whole essay, and I wished I'd saved it. I wrote a whole essay on how society closes a closed society. And it happened shortly after the second Short Creek raid, the one that happened back in like the late 90s, I think, with the false call into
the Jeffs. They talk about that when they in Texas, when they raided the Jeffs group.
The Yearning for Zion Ranch. Sorry, that one. Not Short Creek, but they were the same group, but it was their Yearning for Zion Ranch in Texas. When that whole raid happened, I wrote this whole huge essay on the point about how society closes a closed society. And one of the arguments I was making there is when people, the cult, they'll do it because they're trying to isolate their members. And that was a little bit of what your mom's experience was. But, to my experience, where we were completely open and friendly, and we never, pushed our beliefs or, did anything inappropriate in terms of we weren't sitting there with the neighborhood children, here's a piece of candy and what do you know about polygamy? It's that wasn't a thing that was going on. It was we were just being friendly neighbors, and to see that prejudice go the other way. And it's and you guys, you had that experience, and that's what causes you to be gun shy to share, who and what you are. And it allows the opportunity for then groups that go sideways, especially hard sideways, to easily isolate you, because you have this experience with prejudice when you got, when you got quills, when you extended the hands of, porcupine quills, when you extended the hand of friendship, and then all of a sudden your leader comes out and says, well, now, we just won't associate with Gentiles. That's not a hard sell for that leader to make if you've experienced that before. But if your experience with outsiders has always been positive and loving, like, oh, well, that's your thing, that's not ours, but hey, we love you, and you do you, we'll do us. And if people are still loving and open and really what we should be as Christ-like disciples to each other, then I think that would do more to undermine the power of these groups. You listen to the Darger family, and I remember one interview they did where they talked about how scared they were to take their children to the hospital, when they had broken arms or serious problems, because they were worried the hospital staff would find out who and what they were, and then their children would come and be taken from them. And it's like, if you take away that fear by being open and loving and being like, hey, if there's a problem, we're here with resources and we love you and we're going to help you and do what we can for you. If there's no problem, then great. But but that kind of fear, when you encounter prejudice like that, it closes you up and it allows you to be closed off very easily by nefarious leaders. But anyway,
Nathan,
wow, that was a side bend.
So yeah, I want to delve a little bit into that. Why do you, with all the acceptance of our current society right now, why do you think that this is the last one that people aren't accepting of? Because so you can be a man living with another man, you can be a woman living with another woman, you can marry them in certain states. Why do you think that this particular lifestyle choice is so hard for people for society to accept?
The short answer to that, like in a nutshell, is children. And because the worst examples are what permeates the social conscience, the Warren Jeffs, the ones that are marrying 12 and 13-year-olds and impregnating them, or swapping 14-year-olds among 80-year-old men, and all that sort of wickedness. It's children, and rightly so. Like, and it's just, the day we start losing our revulsion at pedophilia and child predatory behavior, we are in a really, really dark place. And so most people, up until that recent reality show, Sister Wives, their only perception of it was that stuff, because that was all that was on the national news. They never went and found the normal family where they all got married after 18 and it was all consensual and the families were, loving and functional to, an acceptable degree. Those don't make the news. Only the dirty old men make the news. And so I think that's primarily where that revulsion comes in. And it should. That should never be accepted or tolerated in society. And I think this is a hard thing to talk about, because I know that was the attitude when I came into the group 25 years ago. Owen was insisting that people waited until they were at least 18, but he was actually encouraging the young man to be 21 and the young ladies to be 20. That was what I heard with my own ears. And it was like, oh, well, this is great. This 2 thumbs up. This is, this makes a lot more, this is acceptable. However, I'd be dishonest if I didn't fully disclose the reality that prior to my time in the group, I learned later that there had been, marriages of 16 and 17-year-olds that had happened in the very group that I was in. And some of that might have been colored by, the fact that the Warren Jeff split hadn't fully happened, or, and some of that was happening during that tumult where they were, tearing themselves apart. So that's not to make an excuse, but it's like just being upfront and honest, because unless we do get honest, we're going to run into troubles like the church has. The church tried for 50, 60 years to kind of brush under the rug the uncomfortable things in church history that they didn't want to address. And now it's come back to bite them in the butt. And now they're starting to try to come out and be really more honest, open, transparent, try to give context, try to, have upfront discussions about some of the difficult aspects of church history. But it's almost like a day late and a dollar short, because it's, for so many members who grew up with the pristine palace, and to find out that there's all sorts of mud tracks in the basement, it's ruined them. And we run the risk, especially in fundamentalism, of doing the same thing if we aren't honest, if we don't sit there and say, for whatever the reasons, this was stuff that was happening to whatever degree. But at least by the time I showed up, Owen was like 18 minimum, and then ideally 21 for the boys, and they should have a job or a career or know where they're going, and gals should be at least 20. He was encouraging them to be a little more older and mature.
Then he was way ahead of most of them in that regard then, because that's one of the regular tenets of these groups is that they tend to marry young, and that indoctrinates people a little bit further into it. So
couldn't that just maybe we just getting enough in the weeds here, but couldn't that just be part and parcel of the way it's actually polygyny, right? With one man, several wives, right? That's polygyny.
That's the
technical term for it. Polygamy goes either way. Yep. But with
polygamy
being
is one woman, multiple guys. Yep.
But being in a polygamist culture, if there's every man that's married, even maybe has several wives, so one woman and all the men are eligible, right? That means there's more competition for that one woman, right? And if that were the case, wouldn't that drive the man trying to catch her first, and that would drive the age lower and lower and lower? I'm just talking on a societal level.
That's a really interesting observation. I think there's some merit to that argument. And this is why that whole article I wrote about how society closes a closed society, and how important it is that we be open and inviting and transparent and things like that is so important, because what you're saying, I think, is true, especially in one of those closed societies. And that's where you saw a lot of the action where they would kick out half the boys, the whole Lost Boys from the FLDS. It was an effort to reduce, the 80-year-olds didn't want to compete with the 18-year-old, because I don't know, if I was a 14-year-old and I had choice between Scraggles, the 80-year-old patriarch, versus, the 18-year-old kid I got a crush on, guess who wins that one? Well, the easy way for them to do it is to have Scraggles toss out the 18-year-old or the 16-year-old. And it's like, and that's where a lot of that wickedness came from. So I think that and that's, can be, it's a real danger. It's a real reality and risk, and a real source of potential spiritual abuse by its nature.
Yeah. And
this stuff we might save for, because we were going to talk about in our coming episode, we were going to talk about
so you're going to lead us back out of the weeds?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, okay, so let's go ahead and
let's try to wrap this one up.
Yeah, let's do some final thoughts. Thank you, Nathan, for being here. We appreciate you talking about this. We're going to
continue this on. We'll talk some more. We're going to talk about masculinity and Mormon history, kind of get into that. That's coming next. We'll probably do these 1 week at a time. So
yeah. Michael, what are the socials on that?
We got, let me
Michael, you have one job, man. One job.
One job. Geez, now I can't find them. It's
Hello?
Twitter is
I
brothers
thought I told you not to come in here.
at brothers v random. YouTube is at the brothers random. Instagram is at the brothers random. That should be easy. Okay, just
Yeah.
And then if you want to email us, it's the brothers random v at gmail.com.
We're also on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and this will be part 1. Keep reading, keep listening, keep watching, keep learning. We'll talk to you later. Thanks, guys.
To be random or not to be random? That's the question. Whether it is no, not.